All right, so first of all, thanks for the kind of opportunity to talk to you today. I have talked, I think, twice before about Gwangju. But today I'm going to kind of take a different approach to it. And I also want to say that I am not an expert, okay? I'm going to give you kind of my personal perspective of the event and what happened and everything. But I want us to raise some questions, and I want us to have a discussion about some of the issues when we talk about comparing, with the more recent crises. So my perspective, of course, is very personal. There were only a handful of us foreign witnesses during OMPA. And I'm going to give you a little bit of my time during that period. What I want to do after that is talk about the environments in which these two crises arose. Because the environments tell us a lot about how things play out. So I want us to talk about those environments, what they mean, what other conditions we want to think about. And then I want us to have a discussion of some of what we think are the key lessons from these two crises that other countries can learn from. And I particularly say that America can learn from. So I think there's a lot that we can learn from how these crises played out. And I think there's a lot of learning. And I want to just kind of put up some of my ideas, but I'm hoping you all will also contribute and we can have a back and forth. So let's see. I don't think this thing likes me. Okay. Where's the computer? Oh, point it.
No, it's
Oh, there.
here. Try
again. Okay, so we got to point at the computer. Got it. All right. So just so you know, I came to Korea in early 1979. Okay, 24 years of age, so young punk. We had 3 months of training, and then I was assigned to Naju-gun Hoganso, next to Gwangju. My training was to be a leprosy worker. So in Naju-gun, there were 2 leprosy villages. And so my goal was to go to those villages. People had problems with ulcers on their hands and their feet, to try to get those ulcers healed, make sure that they could be functional in society. And because a lot of leprosy patients have a lot of eye complications, to identify what problems people had to get them in for surgery. My job was not to do any of the medical treatment, but to really be a link between the village and the providers. I realized after about 6 months of living in Gwangju town that I couldn't do my job by being in the town, because, if I rode my bike out to the village, I would spend 2 hours riding there and then 2 hours back. So I actually moved in late 1979 to one of the villages. This village called Hohaewan. Hohaewan had about 300 leprosy patients. And so this is kind of me on a daily basis going around, house to house. I had records on all my patients, and I basically had a plan for everybody. So that's what my life was. Every day was pretty much the same, going house to house and, fighting and figuring out what I could do for people in my community. So in terms of what happened around OMPA, the fact is that on May 18 itself, it was a Sunday, a day off. I love to hike. And so actually, Hohaewan is separated from Gwangju by a mountain, okay? And so I often would go hiking up that mountain, and I could see Gwangju, just on the other side. So that's what I was doing on May 18th. I had absolutely no idea what was going on in Gwangju at all that day. When I got back to my village late that afternoon, the first thing that happened was my village leader, he came and found me and said something horrible has happened in Gwangju. But he really didn't have any details. And I was planning to take 2 patients of mine to Suncheon, to the Yosu Aeong Taehwa Pyongwon, where they were going to have eye surgery. So he said, "Are you going to still take them?" I said, "Well, I just come from Seoul a couple days before. There were some demos, but okay, I think it will be okay." So, we get on the local bus, we get to Gwangju, the two of them plus myself. And the first thing I see is a young man basically being beat to death by a soldier. And from that time on, it was a constant story of what was going on in Gwangju that day. But my patients, they kind of pushed me onto the bus to get us out of there. So we went on to Suncheon. I dropped them off at the hospital, made sure everything was okay. And then I went back to Gwangju. When I got back to Gwangju, got into town, the moment I got into town, the bus driver would not go any further. He said, the town is shut off. There was glass and stones and tile and bricks all over the road. So he stopped before we even got into town and said, "We all have to get off." So I went from there over to my friend, Tim Warnberg, who worked in Gwangju, went to his house, and I spent the night at his house. The following morning, I was in the center of town, and the first story I tell in my book in the foreword is what happened when I went to the post office, mailed some letters. I thought it was a pretty innocent thing to do, and there was a lot of commotion going on. And a little old lady, dressed in a hanbok, as I'm stepping off the steps of the post office, she grabs my arm and I think, okay, maybe she needs help across the street. No, what she said to me was, "We have no voice. We cannot talk about what's happened here in Gwangju. You're a foreigner. You have to be our voice." And that was kind of an indication of what was going on, and that people felt completely, there was a huge amount of anger, a huge amount of frustration, and a huge amount of disbelief that their own government, the military, was treating them that way. So that's kind of how I started in Gwangju. I got back to my village midday, probably in the last bus heading south. The next day, I tried to come back into Gwangju, but there was too much gunfire, and I basically said, "This is stupid, go back home." So I went back home, but then the next day, I continued to try to get into Gwangju because the villagers, my village leader and others, came to me with a list of their sons and daughters who were in university in Gwangju. They said, "We want you to find out, are they okay?" And let's face it, as a foreigner, they figured, and rightfully so, that it was easier for me to get around than it was going to be for one of them. So that's why I went back into Gwangju. So I was in Gwangju for the next few days. We had the foreign reporters showed up, Terry Anderson and many others, and we ended up translating for them because there was nobody there to translate. Tim Warnberg, for some of you who know him, his Korean was excellent. So he took the main job of translating what was going on. I worked with a photographer from Time magazine. So I went around with him because he wanted to find out what happened to this person. Where did they go? Questions that I could translate rather than describing a political manifesto, which was completely beyond my capability. Anyways, what we realized was we were getting news broadcasts from Seoul because there was no local broadcast. The news broadcast from Seoul basically said, it is a bunch of hooligans, it is a bunch of communists, it is a bunch of rowdy people, and they are destroying Gwangju, and the good people of Gwangju want the military to come in and take back control. And they also said that the US government was supporting them. And of course, for us to sit there and to see this and to hear this, we ended up saying, okay, somebody's got to get out to get to Seoul to, what's the embassy doing? And because I knew that countryside best, so I said, okay, I can hike over the mountain to get back to my village. So I did that and then went up to Seoul. And then that same night is when the military moved back. So that's just kind of a timeline. So let me just go ahead and go ahead. That's a timeline of what happened. This is my picture as I was going into Seoul, sorry, into Gwangju. And somebody asked me earlier tonight, how come there is still a lot of controversy over the number of people killed in Gwangju? And one of the issues I realized, this is just one example, is that previous day when I was on this road, there were buses and little taxis going back and forth with people, you know, banging on sticks on the side of them in jubilation. Well, when the military moved in, you know, a lot of people were killed. But where were people who were killed? Where did those bodies go? Because they did not end up in the Gwangju, you know, area. You know, they were not being identified in Gwangju. So that's why we still have controversy. I have absolutely no idea. I'm not going to even suggest. But it was a case of a lot of death that was not recorded at the time. And some of you have probably seen this picture. This is Jürgen Hinspeter, who was the taxi driver. That story was about him. This is Tim Warrenberg here, Judy Chamberlain. I'm here, and that's David Gollinger. So it was the four of us who were in Gwangju during that period. And that's on the top of the Cheonnam-dae Pyongyang. So right, that's where Jim used to work. So these photographs are by the time photographer Robin Moyer. So basically, I just followed him around as to what he wanted to do. So he took a whole bunch of pictures, and actually, this is the picture we decided to use on the Korean version of my book. If you've seen the front cover, the English version, publishers felt that was too traumatic for many Koreans, so they didn't want to use that picture. They wanted to use this one instead. And another picture of Robin Moyers. This is all right next to the Go-chun provincial office building.
Have you ever felt threatened for your life during this period?
So did I ever feel threatened? I never felt threatened by people in Gwangju. In fact, I would say people in Gwangju went out of their way to make sure that I was safe and secure. They really took care of us. The only time I felt threatened was by the military, to be honest. So, you know, in Gwangju itself, I felt totally safe. I did learn later, I don't know if it was you, Matt, who told me that there was Chun Doo-hwan wanted to bomb Gwangju.
That's a story, but it's never been totally confirmed.
Okay, so if that was the case, then I probably was in danger, but I did not feel in danger in Gwangju itself, no. Okay, so I wrote, as you can see, I ended up writing a book. To be honest, it took 40 years before I could sit down and write this book. And part of it was that at the time it was traumatic. And the only way I could actually get to sleep at night was I started from like on the second day, I wrote down everything that happened that day in great detail. Because as I wrote it down, I could say, okay, it's there. I don't have to keep circling through my brain all night. So I have all those notes from back then. Because if I had waited that number of years and didn't have those notes, there's no way I could have written the memoir. It would have been totally impossible. But those notes made it possible to do so. I had really no intention of writing a book, and that was partly because I felt that Tim Warrenberg, who went on to actually do academic work on this, and of course, he was much more knowledgeable about everything that happened, that he would be the best person to do it when he died in around 1994. So that took that whole story off the table. So that's where I decided, okay, I need to sit down and actually do this. But to be honest, I also had to wait until I retired. So I spent my career mostly in Africa. I'm an ocular epidemiologist. My wife and I established an institute. We train people from all over Africa. We bring them to our center in Tanzania, which is why I have my shirt. Anyways, I could not actually engage with my mind on doing the book until after I kind of got to the retirement stage. And to be honest, my goal in writing that book was to inform Americans about the events. Because, you know, you would ask anybody in the US about this whole event, absolutely no idea. And one of the reasons why is that same day that this started was the day that Mount St. Helens erupted. So basically Mount St. Helens blew, you know, Gwangju off the front page. So, you know, that, you know, I can always start a talk saying, do you remember where you were when Mount St. Helens erupted? And everybody can raise their hand and say, well, you remember that, but you don't know what happened here. So there was absolutely no knowledge or understanding of Gwangju whatsoever. So in 2019, I had a draft ready and I came back to Korea because I said, okay, I need to have time to visit sites. You know, was that a 3-story building, a 2-story building, you know, kind of make sure that I got some of the setting well. And at the time, I met a gentleman named Gwangju, and he's the one that said to me, you know, there is no account of Owilpal by a foreigner. And what's important is that you just tell your story, not as an academic, but tell your story as it happened to you. You are independent. You are not carrying any kind of flag for one side or the other. You are completely independent. And so that both made it, so I wanted to make sure that it was just my story. And I wanted to make sure that we found a publisher, and thanks to Suzanne, because I was a very close friend with Suzanne. She introduced me to Holland Press, and that's how we got that started. And thanks to Matt, who provided me some of the cables that were sent from the US Embassy to the State Department, DC back then, and things I learned in reading those cables that I had absolutely no idea about until I saw the cables that Matt had provided. Such that I said, okay, I'm putting them in the back of the book. So I put the cables in the back of the book because I think they are very telling as to how the US Embassy viewed us and then what happened after that. So as it turned out, the Korean language version has probably sold 10, 12 times more copies than the English version. So I had no idea that would happen, but you know, apparently there is interest here in Korea, and that has done extremely well. So let's move on to what I really wanted to spend a little time talking to you guys about. So if we talk about the two crises, we got Owilpal and then we've got the martial law. And I wanted to think through what were some of the environments that these events happened. Well, political situation at the time, military dictatorship, and a democracy. So that obviously has a lot of influence on how things play out. The second one, which I think is critically important, is communication. It was completely cut off in Gwangju. There was no phone line. Everything was completely cut off. You could not get any information in or out. So at the time, everybody outside of Gwangju was hearing a story that was very different from what was happening inside Gwangju. And of course, in today, social media, instantaneous. People are communicating right and left And the speed with which it played out at the National Assembly was incredible. But that is so impressive that people rallied so quickly, but that only happened because you have this ability using social media to really connect really quickly. If we had social media back then, the whole situation would have been entirely different. Chun Doo-hwan would have been gone within a week because the rest of the country would have just erupted to realize what had happened. So that's why when we talk about environment, I think communication is really important. Location, okay, Gwangju and Jeonnam versus Seoul. Let's be honest, Gwangju and Jeonnam in general have a very negative perspective by many people throughout Korea. We were a place of bandits, of rebels, you know, that's the perception of people from this area. And so the amount of sympathy that you could generate is much more limited. Of course, here in Seoul, it's quite a bit different. So again, where it happens, I think is really important to realize. How the population was characterized, we were hooligans or communists, I mean, impure elements. I love that one. We were considered impure elements. I'd love to know what a pure element is, but actually there's a lot of similarities with what happened here, you know, communists, anti-state actors. So the same kind of demonization, I think, was going on in both environments. And the response by the population, obviously in Gwangju, fighting back, ejecting the military from Gwangju and those surrounding towns, and the whole concept of resilience. I want you to note when I say surrounding towns, this is a part of the story of Oil I don't think has been adequately captured yet. Everybody has images or stories from Gwangju. A lot happened outside of Gwangju, okay? In all the little towns, in Mokpo and Naju and Damyang and all those little towns, that has not been captured adequately yet. And of course, here, again, I love the images. I was in New York City when this was going on and watching the images of people hoisting parliamentarians over the fence. You know, really people got into this in not just, they didn't feel it was just their duty. There was a joyousness that you saw in the way some people were responding, which I think was so interesting to watch. And it did not stop. The rallies kept going and going and going until it was forced out. I'm putting a blank here because I'd like thoughts from anybody here in the room. What other kind of aspects of the environment do you think, considering these two crises, should be included in terms of how we understand crises like this? Because they all fit within an environment one way or the other. I'm going to give the microphone to you.
Yeah, I'm just guessing here, but I think maybe there's a kind of economic component in the sense that I think in the day of Gwangju, I think most people were fairly poor and just were struggling to get by, whereas I think last year was more, it's almost like an event. If you know what I mean, almost like something like the hobby. So I don't know if that somehow also fits into the game.
Okay, that's interesting. What really surprised me in little towns like Naju and Namgyal, when you think who was out on the streets there, because these are poor rural areas, it was the little halimonis and halibojis and the shopkeepers. They were on the streets. It wasn't students, because the students are all in Gwangju. So even though economically they were in really difficult ways, they were out there demonstrating. I wouldn't say demonstrating. They were out there, they were angry. But I think economics is very different, obviously, from present to past. very different. Any, yeah,
My impression was the national observers, I mean, not the media, but just the average person, Korean. In the case of Gwangju, there was a lot of skepticism about what was going down in Gwangju because of regional prejudices and so on, and also they're getting the propaganda from the Seoul government. Whereas there was more of a across-the-board outrage in December. How could this happen, you know? And that's why this is a quick response by the people.
so the outrage here was stimulated by the martial law announcement, where you think of the outrage in Gwangju was precipitated by the massacre of mostly young people. But how it plays out was very, very different.
Well, in the sense that we've grown past all this.
Right.
In December.
Right.
Whereas in May, it's still, this is part of the real politics
Of the day.
of the day.
Yeah. Right. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
It's kind of a question, a fact check, a comment. I wondered about the pre-communication for 12/3, and I've been curious, how did it happen so fast? And I mean, was there just there is a true we love Korea, we're standing up for Korea. But in addition to that, there had to be some logistics going on. Were there networks already existing? Were there huge networks? Were there just small networks? Did it just balloon? How did all that happen before they actually got in touch with each other?
Who would like to respond to that one? Basically, the question is, how did that response happen so quickly in December? Was there a specific kind of mechanism that people communicated through, or was it just spontaneous people calling each other, or who wants to chime in on that?
Could I perhaps not chime in on that?
Perhaps just to raise one more thing, while people do consider it. I'm not sure why, but I feel a little bit uneasy about the severity of these and comparing how there might be people in this room that are not quite sure what happened in Gwangju, or how many people lost their lives, and are we right? And it's still unclear here. And I'm not saying we can get an easy number, but the comparison between these two events, is it apt without that information? Thank you.
And what I wanted to do is more to talk about the environments in which they each arose. So that's obviously going to be different in both of those settings, yeah.
Not that I agree with what I heard, but I did talk to people who were there. One was an Irish priest, and I'm not sure what his politics are, but his order tends to be pretty sympathetic to the people, but still could be very conservative. And he was of the opinion that there were other things going on beyond Gwangju, with Kim Dae-jung and others looked for power and was looking as an opportunity to stir up things to discredit the government at that time. And then the thing about calling people communists was pretty reckless, but at the same time, if we're going to be honest about all this, unlike North Korea, South Korea is an open society. And if you're an agent for the North, you could, of course, take advantage of situations like this to try to stir it up. So I'm not prepared to say that there were no communists there, because there are communist agents throughout South Korea, even today. And that's the prerogative of the DPRK to take advantage of an open society.
I think one of the things that the way communist is used and was used at that time as a catch-all, it was used as a derogative. It was used as these people, and they're mostly young people, are there with ulterior motives. So that's how communist was used, not so much that they are agents of North Korea. But you're right. It wouldn't surprise me that there weren't a few agents of North Korea around somewhere. Don't know. Okay, so we have a few additional things there. So the one thing that, and when I talk about Owen Pillai, I'm often talking about it from a standpoint of what can we learn from this event, and what can we learn from what happened in December? And when I first drafted this, you know, I thought, okay, what can Americans learn? What can Iranians learn? What can Hungarians learn? Well, I drafted it before, you know, the election in Hungary, but I decided to keep it up there because I think, you know, we need to learn from all of these events, because it's not just an issue of trying to make sure we don't repeat them, but it's more from a standpoint of, as we learn from every event, we become better able to respond and to ensure that things don't happen again. So the first thing I thought about was use of mobile phones to capture and share images. And if I think about that particular thought, some of you will remember that in Minneapolis recently, where ICE was going around and dragging people out of homes and out of vehicles, and 2 people were killed. If we did not have mobile phones and capturing exactly what had happened to those people, the stories of their lives and the stories of what happened to them would not be known. So the ability to have those images is so important. And I think that what it says is that how can we ensure that in any setting where we have, you know, whether it be an uprising or some type of event like our crises, how can we ensure that those images are captured? And how can we ensure those images are kept and not lost? I can imagine that in some countries right now, China may be one of them, I don't know. You know, the fact is that images that you try to upload would probably be sanitized. So what do you do? So that's my first thought. Anybody want to add to that one about images? Do you think that they are absolutely critical for our understanding of how we learn from these events?
So historically, yes, but I would say prospectively, somebody who works significantly with generative AI.
Yeah. Ah, okay, I'm gonna have you.
All I would say is historically, yes, I think that is accurate and very insightful. Prospectively, I think that is what I think generative AI has and will continue to spread and be quite ubiquitous all over. And the use of generative AI for, you know, both positive, but also subversive and malicious intent is only going to grow. And, you know, the real challenge right now with technicians is how do you discern what's real and what's not? And there is no good way, no reliably just yet. And who knows if there will be. I know people work on that, but it's really, that may not be something that's easy in the future.
Very, very interesting, very good point. AI is changing so many aspects of our lives. And as you say, images are being manipulated as we speak. So the second thing that strikes me is how we can communicate quickly. And whether it be just mobile phones or social media. I saw in Egypt, you know, in the Arab Spring, everything started by communication, that young people were communicating at the speed of light with each other, and then rallies happened and people got together, all based upon the ability to use a mobile phone or social. And I'm going to guess that again will continue to be a way that people get together. That's how people mobilize, is through that kind of networking. And honestly, it's going to be young people that do that rather than the older generation, because they are more facile with it, and that's part of the way they network. Any comments or thoughts on that one? We agree that that's probably, are we gonna get into trouble with AI on that one too?
No, there's a concept called techno-feudalism. A lot of those networks are, sorry. There's a concept called techno-feudalism. A lot of those networks are controlled by very large capitalists or nationalist or entities. Those are only consolidating. And so that there is something called the Great Firewall of China, for example. That right now is open and relatively free, and communication is fluent and flows relatively freely. There are people who worry about that consolidation and continuing consolidation, especially after sort of the rupture of, let's say, populism in the last 10 years. What will nationalist states do to block network access, control network access, and how good will that be in the future? Again, I'm not saying no, I'm just, those are some concerns that others have had about the future, not now, what has been, but what may be.
And we're seeing in the US right now a consolidation of networks. And that may have an impact upon how we get information, how we communicate. Again, we don't know, but we have seen that consolidation. It does continue.
Oh, so that you were translating for Time magazine, the photographer.
The photographer,
Can you
yes.
Tell us what you think, realistically, what was the impact of getting those photos out? Some of them.
To be honest, I have to say I have no idea. And I can say I have no idea because during this time, all of our news media that we were getting in Korea was all censored. So when we would get a Time magazine, all the sections, anything related to Korea, if it was anything critical, was censored. So I had absolutely no idea whether any of his photographs got out. We never had any access to that. So I only, after what was 1987 or so, when things started to ease up, did I ever see any kind of images. I never saw anything. Never saw any news related to Korea that was actually, presenting the situation there until way, way later.
That's because you were in Korea.
That's because I was in Korea.
But probably the rest of the world, they kind
They-
of gone through.
There were some newspaper articles, New York Times, Wall Street Journal. There were some articles, definitely, but I never saw any of them at the time. One of the things that I observed in Gwangju was how people worked together. And I was so impressed with what I'll call the resilience of people in that town. So one of the days I was walking up to the provincial office, they had set up tables and they had these banners, and the banners had the names of Cheonnam-dae and a couple other universities and a couple of factories. And there were a line of people in front of those tables, and they were lining up to volunteer for different activities that need to happen. So there was a few guys who were, like, say, driving the photographer or myself around town because there was no bus service and there were drivers, there were people who were cooking. There were people who obviously were manning the lines around town. But the way that people got together and organized themselves was so impressive. Because I am afraid that in many places there would be total chaos, but it wasn't chaos. It was organized. People organized themselves. And that to me, I think is so important. And to me, it's like one of those things that I learned is that how you get that kind of community solidarity, how you get it going is critical. And they did it, okay? And I suspect that you could see that happening here in Seoul, a year and a half ago. There was a solidarity by people saying, we don't want to see martial law implemented. Does that make sense in terms of kind of what's going on? So the resilience is kind of playing off that previous one, but you know, the fact is that people in Gwangju knew they were completely outnumbered. I mean, that was obviously the case from day one, but they did not back down. And when I say they did not back down, not everybody, there were people who said, we have to hand over all our weapons to the military, because if we don't, they will come in and everybody will be killed. So there was a lot of back and forth as to what to do. But the bottom line is that there was a sense by people that they were right. They had a right to defend themselves. They had a right to be there in the front lines. One story that really impressed me in the little town of Nampyeong, which is just south of Gwangju. When I was walking into Nampyeong that day, the people gathered around the police station. And what they did was they took a big, wrench, and they broke the lock to the armory, because every police station has an armory. So they broke the lock to the armory, and then they started passing out weapons to all the people who would take one. And then there was a vehicle came up, and it was somebody coming from Gwangju, it was one of the students. And they said to everybody, said, no, you've got to put the weapons back, because if the military comes in and they see you with weapons, you will be killed. And so they started to hand them back. And then, I mean, truly, this was a halaboji, and, really old guy wearing a more traditional hanbok. He said to the crowd, no, we will not hand them back. But what we're going to do is we are going to break all of these weapons. So everybody took whatever they were holding and they smashed them in the street. And they created a huge pile of smashed gun stocks, and weapons right there in the middle of the street. So when I think of the fact that they're resilient, they knew that they were in a bad way. But doing the task of destroying those weapons, there was a joy in everybody's face. They felt that they could do something, even if it was small. And so that was just kind of an indication of both resilience and how to make sure that as a group, they made it through this event. The next one has to do with leadership. So in Gwangju, in the provincial office building, there was a committee that did form. And it had representation from the students and a representation from the business community. The governor had left, but then he came back later, and a representation from another group. There was an old guy who had been a resistance fighter against the Japanese. I mean, it was a real eclectic group of people who were on this committee, and their job was to figure out, what are we going to say to the military? How are we going to respond? And although their views varied, they tried to come up always with a consistent common message, because they felt that we have to keep people together, even though we have different, and there was some yelling back and forth, but even though there was some disagreement, they felt that they had to have a common message for town. Of course, here in Korea, there's always been a strong tradition of students, demonstrating. And that is not something that we see certainly in the US anymore. We did during Vietnam War, yes. But we don't really see young people out there on the streets now in America. Who's out demonstrating at the No Kings rallies? It's my generation. Okay. And actually, I don't blame students, because they are afraid. I've talked to a lot of people, they are afraid that if they are photographed out on the street, it may, create difficulties in terms of work, their work environments. They don't feel that they are safe in doing so. So it has changed, things have changed. But I really think I think it's important to get students involved. I really do. I think they need to be, it's their future. They need to be part of it. But the environment right now is such that they are very nervous to do so. And that's really unfortunate. So how do we switch that around? I don't really have an answer for that. The other thing I find really interesting is, you know, if we look at Seoul being the capital versus Washington, DC being the capital, everything happens in Seoul now. You know, Seoul is a center of everything in Korean politics. But Washington, DC is a small little town. It's not a big city. It is not, I will say it's not a dynamic city. It's kind of a sleepy city. It's not a city that has lots of young people and universities. It's not where people go, you know, because that's where all the job opportunities are. It's not like Seoul in any way or fashion. And the US as a country, it's you know, it's very dispersed. So we think of the centers where you'll see demonstrations. Washington, DC is not part of that list. It's going to be Minneapolis or Los Angeles or Chicago. So how you organize people and how you have influence is very different if it's so dispersed in terms of population, as opposed to if it's very centralized, like here in Seoul. So I think for many people, it's how do we learn how to deal with settings that are so dispersed? It's not something that we can copy the Korean model on that, because we don't have that kind of level of cohesiveness. And the last one here has to do with conspiracy theories, which comes back to some of the AI issues that you're talking about. But the fact is that authoritarians in every setting always try to create this view of the enemy within. Because that's how you generate your own support, is by identifying the enemy within, and that is to be, you know, fought against in one way or the other. I think that is true in every setting where we have to deal with those kind of crises, like we saw here or like we're seeing elsewhere. So those were just 8 different kind of lessons that come to my mind that we can learn from Owilpal, as well as what happened here in December of 2024. Any thoughts on any other lessons that you think, whether it's Americans, Iranians, the Hungarians, have already got through some of this, but what other lessons do you think that we can take from Korea to help countries that are in these kind of democratic crises?
It's really not my thought, but Yale University's Tim Snyder has devoted his career in Central Europe, and he was very much close to what was happening in Hungary, and he's very sympathetic to the No Kings demonstrations, and people come up to him and say, what are we going to do? We have these big demonstrations that doesn't seem to make any changes. And he said, well, the difference is you work towards something. You just don't have big demonstrations. So, well, when the primaries come around, we'll kind of get there and we'll kind of work through it. He said, no, you gotta work towards something, and that can be, you know, grassroots organizations. It can be belonging to a political party, but you have to work the process towards the outcome. And look what happened in Hungary. They worked the process, and it's not like they ended up with a liberal firebrand. They came up with a more moderate conservative, but that was more along the lines of the masses of the people.
Yeah, to follow up on the previous comment, remembering the euphoria over Arab Spring, and my understanding of today, of the effect and the aftermath, is that it's pretty much back to you know, original and not much has improved, is my understanding, I might be mistaken. So, it raises, if that's the case, it raises the question of maybe there's something else, to pay attention as much and work on as much in terms of, process, such that when there is something like Arab Spring, we do in fact have, practical results that, come close to the ideals of those protests. And, I've observed, that much of the symptoms of the uprisings here and there, including the presentation today, I wonder if, we could also pay attention to some of on the causes. In other words, yes, demonstration, but what caused those demonstrations might be something to give us food for thought. One last comment about the conspiracy theories within. I think there is a difference of connotation when you say communist or communist here compared to when you say communist or communist in the US. If you picture, remember what happened when USSR came close to a remote island off the coast of US, and the whole country was up in, and so if you imagine Canada or Mexico to be the Soviet Union, and then you say commie or communist within the States, I think it would have a different connotation than the usual understanding that Americans have about, oh, I'm using the word to sort of frame people up.
I think the word communist is like a scare tactic in America. Doesn't really mean anything, but it's a scare tactic. Any other thoughts?
Thank you very much. Wonderful talk so far. You asked what lessons could America learn from this? I'll just make 3 very quick suggestions, if I may. First would be that the West doesn't have a monopoly on democracy, that the world is big now and we don't need to look always to the city on the hill, but democracy does exist in East Asia and it exists here in South Korea. That's a beautiful thing. The second thing that I think would be that sometimes our understanding of Korean people is incorrect. We sometimes, or they're depicted in mainstream media as in a gender war, addicted to designer products and all sorts of things. But I think what we learned on Lisan was that they are educated, they are civically active, they vote, they care about their democracy, and they also care about their nation. They're very proud and patriotic people. So I think the second thing we learn is that education matters. And this is a highly educated, civically active thing. And the third thing that we could see, maybe as a British man, I'll say this is more for the French than the Americans, but peace works. Peace works. Peaceful protest is effective, and that we don't necessarily need to turn over cars and light Molotovs. I know that has been done in the past here. This is not a clean history of protest, but South Korea has demonstrated in 2016 and 2000, and this one as well, that peaceful protest can bring change when it's done correctly. Those 3. Thank you again.
Yeah, I've had a few episodes in the US where people have actually brought up Korea, saying, how come we can't be like Korea? Which I find that interesting that they're actually recognizing what Korea managed to do and managed to save their democracy. So obviously the well-educated Americans are making that distinction. So we just got to make sure that we kind of filter it down as best as we can. I've got one here and then one here, and then we're going to wrap up because I think we'll have some questions.
So I'm going to get myself in trouble here. But when you say the Koreans have saved democracy, quote unquote, only half of them would agree with that. There's still a strong support for Park Chung-hee. There's still strong support for Yoon Suk-yeol.
Yeah.
And those people believe that democracy was damaged and if not destroyed by the communists.
Thank you, David. So I'm Korean. So in May 18th, the democratization, online democratization. At that time, I was there in Busan. Now it's 46 years later. So then we must need a reconciliation between, Jeolla province and Gyeongsang province. But this is, we may have missed the right time through reconciliation, even though very important online democracy or democratization movement, very, very good. But we missed in through reconciliation. Again, more deep-rooted regionalism between Jeolla province and Gyeongsang province. Now sometimes they criticize exchanging videos or videos. So then finally, we need reconciliation. Even though you're professor, you're in foreigners, and then you witness what you think about it is we need more reconciliation. Thank you.
I've heard that question before, because what we, at the time, it was always said that the soldiers who were in Gwangju were from Gyeongsang-namdo. And therefore, that animosity between Cheonnam and Gyeongnam was kind of reiterated over and over again. How much of that is actually true, I cannot say. I think it's always, those two provinces have always had I won't say a fight, but they've always been in competition with each other. And of course, Gyeongnam got all of the support from President Park and from Chun Doo-hwan, because they were from those provinces. So they got the financial support. That's where the shipbuilding was. That's where a lot of the factories were. And basically, Cheonnam was considered to be an agricultural area and poor, so it never received the kind of financial support from the national government that the Gyeongsangs did. So that kind of, competition is always there. How to address it? This is where I say I cannot speak to that. I don't know how to address it. I have one more question. Is that going to address, you want to hit that? I have one more point. Okay.
Look at it, you're very good, the points you made, but
Okay, let's one last one, and I'll get it back to you.
The naming of the Gwangju incident. If I describe it as Gwangju Sate, I will accused, I will criticize. The formal naming for that incident is Gwangju Democratization Movement. So, and also government enacted it. The act is called Gwangju Minjuwa Undong. So if you have some different opinion regarding this naming, will be accused. You don't have freedom of expression that is guaranteed in the Constitution because it contravenes national security and other liberty contained in the Constitution clause. And also, it's still very controversial, and we have lots of unresolved issues. From what perspective you see, still some section of Korean people see it as insurgents, and not big group of people, but it's categorized as democracy movement. I approved of that. Yeah, I share the view. And also, some group of people who are victimized are compensated for that victim. But we are not sure because it was not publicized. The list of about 5,600 people are on that compensation list still. So many people dispute that.
So of course, when I was here, it was always the Gwangju Sate. And I objected to that because it made it sound like everything was just Gwangju. So I was glad when there was a renaming, because then it was taken in more than just Gwangju. But not my choice to make a name. That's how it happened.
I have one friend who's from Gyeonggi-do, and he would created a lot of problems on campus as a university student. So the prosecutor said, look, I'm going to prosecute, or you're going to go to the military, specifically special forces. So lo and behold, there he was unexpectedly put in the front line, and he said, we were given the carbines, but no ammunition, because we heard, oh, this is a small local demonstrations, no reason to, be carrying, loaded firearms. And he said, I hate to say this, but had we been issued ammunition, and when the crowd started pushing against us, realizing we were not going to fire, but had someone fired, it may have nipped some of the violence right in the bud. True or false? But the point being is, a lot of these guys who were sent into Gwangju, I suspect, really didn't have an axe to grind with Gwangju, but people from the outside were stereotyping what was going on.
All right, well, I'm gonna wrap it up because I think it's important we don't stay